hell's my... Ah, there it is. Make yourself a campaign guide. It does help. Hello, adventurers! I am the Welsh DM, the one Welshman who's hoping their accent turns up for the start of their campaign. And this video is the start of a brand new series on how to become an okay GM. There is plenty of advice out there on the internet on how to get started GMing and how to become an amazing GM, but I think for the vast majority of people, they just want to be good enough to have some fun at the table with their friends. We don't all need to become the next Matt Mercer, Abria Iyengar or Brennan Lee Mulligan to tell fantastic stories and have a good time on a Friday night with those we want to play with. And since we're at the start of the series, what better place than to start where we should all start our campaigns with a good session 0. These are my 5 S's to a good session 0 that'll make sure you have an okay campaign when you start. Firstly, and in my opinion the most important, is scheduling. After all, you can't have a campaign if people can't agree when they're going to play. Now, we've all been there, whether it's the start of a campaign or even mid-campaign, where everyone's trying to get their calendars all lined up and it's always a question of, when are you free? When are you free? Oh, I've got a birthday that weekend, and nothing ever lines up, and it's an absolute complete headache, and you end up not scheduling a session for months. Using your session 0 to set out a scheduling agreement with everyone at the table can avoid this headache entirely and figure out when is best for everyone who wants to play. It sets the expectation, and for the people that it doesn't work for them, well, maybe they just don't join in this campaign and they wait around for the next one, or maybe even join as a guest character now and again during the campaign when they can turn up. So what constitutes scheduling in a session 0? Well, in my opinion, there's 2 particular avenues you need to consider. The first is your playing schedule, and the second is how you're going to handle conflicts. Playing schedule is your agreed upon set regularity and time, day of the week that you will all sit down to play the game. This can be weekly, it can be fortnightly, or even monthly. It's whatever suits you and your table's lifestyles. Take Unrolled Stories, the actual play on this channel. While we would all love to play weekly, we've realised that with many people working to a fortnightly rota, it doesn't work for our work-life balance, and we're much better off playing fortnightly. It avoids burnout for both me as a GM and for the players, and it allows people to schedule things around the game without feeling like they're either having to give up on things outside of life or cause issues for the group as a whole. Taking 20, an old channel here on YouTube, once advocated for the 3-on, 1-off schedule, which I personally think is a great one. You play weekly, but only for 3 weeks in a row, and then the last week of the month you take off. What this allowed people to do is get that feeling of a weekly game, while still also ensuring that that day of the week still had the opportunity for people to book other life events on once or even twice a month. Ultimately, it's about finding what works for you and your group such that you fit it around your lives and you're having the most fun and you're actively engaged every time you sit down to play. The second thing you need to consider when it comes to scheduling, and is something that's often overlooked, is how you will handle when someone does have a conflict on game night. If you don't discuss this in a session 0, you can often end up having to discuss this during the campaign and having no set agreement, and it will often lead to you playing less games. What this looks like is just as a table sitting down and deciding how many of you need to be there to feel like you've got enough people there to play the game. Again, using Unrolled Stories as an example, we have a rule where if one person is unavailable, the session will go ahead anyway. Their character will either be controlled by other people or just fade into the background, or I'll, as the GM, find a reason that they disappear for the session if that's possible. If 2 are unavailable, ideally the session will go ahead unless one of those characters is critical to the current plot. The point is, the session still gets to go ahead, and we don't feel like we're debating every time whether we should or should not, because we know what the expectation is. There isn't one correct answer for this. It's about what works for your table balance. If you have a smaller party, you may want everyone there because it is noticeable when someone isn't. When you have a larger table, you can probably get away with 1 or maybe 2 people not being around. The second S is safety tools. This is probably the one that most people know best, as there are dozens of tools, videos and blog articles telling you how to consider and use safety tools in your TTRPG game and setting them up in a session 0. They are critical for making sure that everyone can have full fun at the table and not be worried about experiencing something that they will find uncomfortable and unenjoyable. Hopefully you will never have to actively use a safety tool in a session, but it is much better to have them there if a player or even the GM needs them than to not have them and cause friction at the table. There are plenty of different systems out there, from lines and veils to X cards to consent forms. Look into all of them in your own free time and figure out what you need to use at your table and engage with your players as to what they want to see as well. My personal recommendation is the TTRPG Safety Toolkit, which can be found just by searching for it online. It is a Google Drive full of great resources for you to use at your table to ensure everyone can have a fun and anxiety-free time at the table. In short, use your session 0 to discover what topics are off the table and which ones are on the table for your campaign. This doesn't just mean the players, it also means you as the GM putting out there what you will not be touching because you yourself are not comfortable with it either. And also, remember, people change. People's icks and issues will alter during a campaign, especially if it's a long-running thing, so keep the door open to people wanting to change what they've said is on or off the table if they become uncomfortable with new things, or if they want to explore something, maybe behind a veil moving forward. Number 3, style of game. The beauty of TTRPGs is we can use them to tell so many different kinds of story, and people play them to experience so many different forms of story as well. The downside to this, however, is it can mean people come to the table with wildly different expectations as to what the story is going to be and how they're going to engage with it. This is why it's important to cover the style of game in a session 0 and make sure everyone is on board and in the right frame of mind for when the campaign starts. If we use D&D as a good example, D&D is founded on the concept of 3 pillars of play: combat, social, and exploration. We can use this as a GM in a session 0 to explain to our players what pillar is perhaps going to be the most dominant and how the others are going to interact with it during the campaign. And get the feedback from the players. Are the players just wanting to turn up on a Friday night once a month, roll some dice, kill some monsters, and gain some treasure? Well then, you as a GM don't want to be presenting those players with a political intrigue campaign that focuses on the social pillar. Similarly, your players may want to explore a deep political narrative with twisting factions and shady underbellies of the major city in the world. And if you come with a dungeon crawl game, that's going to jar expectations. Now, more than likely, your table is going to have a complete mix of types of players who want slightly different things from their game. What you need to do as a GM is facilitate that and make sure everyone is getting what they want as best you can. If you can identify what each player is looking for, you can then, as the GM, sprinkle those moments through the campaign to make sure they get that satisfaction they're looking for. Unrolled Stories, during our session 0 coming off the Goats of Wrath campaign, pretty much all of the players said they wanted a greater opportunity to roleplay more and use their words to shape the story and the ongoing events of the world. And that sounded great to me, so with Unrolled Stories, I've included a lot less combat than I probably went in expecting to when I was prepping the campaign. The players have had much more opportunity to talk to important NPCs during low stakes or just tense negotiations, rather than there being weapons drawn during any moment. And it's allowed me to use combat to punctuate certain moments, to embed it in their memories as this is an important moment because it's that much rarer. It's also worth including genre in these discussions for your session 0. What kind of campaign is this going to be? And that's on you as the GM to bring to the table. Because you're going to have a very different game if it's high fantasy compared to dark fantasy, compared to sci-fi, compared to modern horror. As a GM, you probably already have a concept for the kind of genre or story you want to be telling for this campaign. So give it to your players early so they know whether this campaign is right for them. There's nothing wrong with them going, this horror campaign isn't something I'm looking for, I'll come back when there's a new campaign on the table and possibly play then. Number 4 is systems and special rules. Once you know the kind of game that you want to run, it's now time to figure out what system will let you run it best. Now, people will default to D&D 5th edition quite a lot, and it is an incredibly versatile game and can probably do 75% of whatever you're looking for. But at the end of the day, it is still a game centered around the concept of fighting monsters and gaining treasure. And if you want to tell a crime noir thriller story, it might not be the best system for you, and you might want to explore stuff like Gumshoe or any of the Powered by the Apocalypse systems. As mentioned, genre is key to narrative and storytelling, and you should really interrogate whether the genre you want to explore is best run in the system you're considering. D&D has shown its scope when it comes to genre, with the standard swords and sorceries high magic, to Grim Hollow's dark fantasy, all the way to Eberron with its verging on sci fantasy with its arcanotech and other such inventions. But that doesn't mean it is the best for what you're trying to tell. Off the top of my head, if you're trying to tell an alien-like sci-fi horror, D&D is not going to work for you. Instead, you might want to consider something like Mothership that is custom made and designed to tell those stories. Just because D&D is the default system in TTRPGs doesn't mean it has to be at your table, and doesn't mean it should be your first thought when you think of a campaign idea. Consider reading other rulebooks out there just to get an idea of what other options are on the table. All I'm saying is explore your other options when looking to start a new campaign. Are you thinking of telling a story of rebels uprising against their oppressors? Then check out Spire. Are you wanting to tell a story about criminal gangs conducting raids and thefts? Well, then you should definitely check out Blades in the Dark. Maybe you're intrigued about Percy Jackson and wanting to replicate that at your table. Well, check out Scion. It's built for demigods in the modern world. There is a whole library of games out there, so it doesn't hurt to look beyond the norm and explore and experience other opportunities and ways of telling stories. Now, of course, you may end up choosing D&D anyway because it's a system you're familiar with and everyone just wants to get on with the campaign, which is where house rules come in as the best way to tweak 5th edition to fit the narrative and genre you want. There are loads of subsystems and house rules out there, including from officially D&D, that will tweak the game to suit different narratives. Take Grimhollow with its alternative rest mechanics and lingering wounds system, which helps D&D feel darker, grittier, and more dangerous. Or from D&D themselves with the mythic odyssey of Theros' piety system that explores the relationship between the characters and their patron gods in a much closer, more tangible way than D&D usually would, allowing you to explore how gods and mortals influence the world on a tangible level. Even Critical Role uses unconventional mechanics for resurrection just to make the game feel more consequential and have death mean something more. Session 0 is the time to discuss all of these options and decide which ones you want to use as a table. Personally, as a GM during my Session 0s, I like to use an opt-in, opt-out system to give the players an idea of what I want to bring into the game, but not forcing it upon them. Opt-in rules are only used if the majority of the table votes to include them, otherwise by default they are switched off. These tend to focus on fun ways to tweak the way 5th edition works at your table, compared to opt-out rules which are much more focused on the kind of story I as a GM want to tell, wherein automatically they will be used unless a large number of the players don't want to use them because they don't think they sound fun. Regardless, the point is, if you are going to use house rules that adjust how a system works from its default, they need to be discussed in a Session 0 such that everybody understands them before the first session begins. Because ultimately, it's not fun if the GM just springs a house rule on you that fundamentally changes what you are about to do in the game. My 5th and final S is shared connections and world building. Session 0 is the time to weave everyone's characters together and to shape the world itself. There's a couple of aspects to this. First, shared world building. You, as the GM, likely have already built or decided upon a world that you want to run for this campaign. In your Session 0, it's now time to hand that world carefully to your players and have them ask questions about it. Have them poke and prod it to make sure it feels fully realised and lived in, and let them shape it themselves. Maybe they were intrigued by a certain faction you mentioned at the start of the session 0. Maybe there's a particular god that they want for their cleric that they want to make sure will be included in the world. Or maybe they've got an idea as to how magic will work for their character and want to make sure it fits into your world building. The point is to allow the players to feel like they can shape the world enough such that their character concept will fit easily and smoothly and ingratiate themselves into the world. And for you as the GM, it's an opportunity to get fresh ideas that maybe you hadn't considered and brainstorm with your players to expand upon the world that you've already created in a way that is dynamic, fun, and will be more engaging to your players than if you had just told them this is how it is. Remember, this is a shared storytelling experience, so make the world that as well. The second important element of this is shared connections. This is more for the players to figure out amongst themselves, but you as the GM can help shape and nudge ideas such that it fits into the world. If the players can all come together and ensure that each character has at least one strong connection or bond to another character in the party, then it will make early campaign roleplay and interaction that much smoother. Because ultimately they're going to have something to talk about, to interact with someone else, rather than it just being a group of strangers who happen to meet in a tavern. This can vary from the characters grew up in an orphanage and have now just reconnected, to two characters met in the local fighting pit last week and have a burgeoning respect to each other. Or maybe it's just a bodyguard, prisoner, paladin, rogue dynamic that is just conflict from the start to explore. You'll be surprised how many fun, wild, and weird concepts come out of these discussions. Especially the kind of plot threads that GMs can take and weave into the central storyline to make a more interesting narrative. By a session 0, most players are probably going to have a concept of what character they would like to run for this campaign. What you can do in a session 0 is make sure that no one is going to be stepping on each other's toes with their concept. By sharing what each person is looking to do with their character, you can make sure you don't end up with two very similar characters in the party. Or maybe you do want two similar characters in the party and want to explore that dynamic of how they're so similar yet different in subtle ways. And those are the 5 S's to running an okay session 0. Scheduling, safety tools, style of game, system and rules, and shared world building. Now, this doesn't encapsulate everything for running a session 0. There are many other things you can consider. If you want to know more about session 0s, I recommend Magpie's video. I will link it either up here somewhere or down in the description below. They give a load more other concepts for you to consider about session 0, so I really do recommend you give it a watch. But what other elements do you think go into making a pretty decent, okay session 0? Let me know in the comments below what you do at a session 0 to make sure everyone feels included and the game goes off without a hitch. As always, if you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like. It does help appease the ephemeral evil algorithm that's out there in the mist. And if you enjoy this kind of content, please feel free to subscribe and hit the bell notification icon to make sure you never miss a video when I upload. Anyway, I do believe that's it. You should now feel equipped to go run the okayest of session 0s. So, until we do this again, you keep an eye out for dragons. I'm going to go tell my accent the campaign is about to start. And remember to keep telling stories.